It is episode number 4 of Tank's Talks, and today is something that's really, really close to my heart. So it's going to be the first time that I really talk about autism and how autism plays a role in my life, my family's life, and particularly within the subject of self-diagnosis, which right now is a really relevant subject. It's quite a spicy subject, and it's something that I actually feel is incredibly important to talk about. So before I go anywhere, if you are relatively new here or if you don't know, my son, who is 12, is diagnosed with autism. He was diagnosed around 6 years ago. So autism as a parent is all I have ever really known. And then at the moment, my daughter, who is 10, is currently on the pathway. She has been officially referred for her autism assessment after realising that actually she was showing quite a few autistic traits. So where does that lead to with how it kind of affects my life and the sensitive subject of self-diagnosis? So before I start, I'm an advocate for self-diagnosis, but then I'm also against it. So I do play a double role within this particular subject. Now, I feel like self-diagnosis is really, really, really relevant for some people, but then for others, it's actually something that social media is breeding quite dangerously. So it's, put it in layman's terms, I, as a woman that is 34 in 2 weeks, actually, by the time this comes out, I will possibly already be 34. So I, as a woman that is, I'm pretty much in my mid-30s, I have spent my whole life never fitting in. I've never understood myself, but then equally I've never really understood other people. And it wasn't until my son's diagnosis that I actually knew much about autism. So when I was younger, although it existed, you didn't really hear of diagnoses. And if you did, it was normally those that actually had really high supportive needs that would be autistic. So you're thinking along that Asperger's line, almost like that classical Rain Man situation. It wasn't kind of really something that even you had in classes at schools. You had kids with ADHD and they were stereotypically the naughty kids, which is actually horrible to even think that that's how they would have like looked at. But autism just, it wasn't a focus. It wasn't a diagnosis that was understood already happened. So when Warwick was diagnosed, I fought incredibly hard for his diagnosis because I knew with him that there was differences and there was things that I was seeing as a parent, and he just spoke so many autistic traits. It was incredible. So it's up until that point, it wasn't something that had ever kind of come into play for myself. And in all honesty, autism didn't become an option for me personally, realistically, until I met my wife. So I had always struggled in relationships, whether that was understanding somebody else and understanding somebody else's feelings, or them even beginning to understand me and mine. And I'd always tried to kind of appease the people that I was with, and be that typical like good girl, well behaved, kind of fit in that box, but I never fit in it. And then when I met Kelly, she was the first person to kind of really look at me and notice that potentially my emotions, my reactions, my thoughts, my feelings were a little bit different to what most people would have. So she was actually the one that kind of came forward and said to me, you know, Grace, have you ever considered that potentially you might be autistic? And it wasn't said in a nasty way, it was actually said in a really helpful way, because she could see that there were situations where I was struggling to understand myself, or I was struggling to even voice myself. And it was a conversation that kind of we went round, we had, and then I noticed, and the school also noticed, that Brooke was starting to show kind of certain traits of autism. So luckily, because of what, you know, the fight that I'd had with Warwick and his autism, I was able to kind of spot that, push for it, and push her through to an assessment. But actually, Brooke and I are very, very, very similar. So it was around the time where the Senko kind of agreed, actually, there are traits there, and she required a referral, that it kind of really sunk in my head, and I realised that I fit the autistic spectrum very, very well. And the more actually I dug into myself, the more I looked into myself, and the more that I learn about female autism in particular, because it is very, very different in representation to men, the more I recognised myself. It was as if every part of me was suddenly falling into place, and I finally had an opportunity to understand myself, explain myself, and also make sense of why I do the things I do and why I am the way that I am. Now, unfortunately, in my county where I live at the moment, there is around a 4 to 5 year waiting list for an adult diagnosis, which would put me at about 38, 39, potentially 40 if it got any longer, before I was diagnosed. Which for me is actually quite destructive. If I have to spend the next 4 to 5 years of my life not knowing who I am, not being able to say, these are my needs, or this is how I feel and why, that's really quite detrimental. So I made the decision to kind of self-diagnose a little while ago, just for my own mental clarity. It's not something that I'm massively forthcoming with. It's not something that I particularly advise others to do. And I'm always very open in the sense that, having had one child with a set solid diagnosis, another on the pathway, indicates to me that actually I'm probably really valid in that diagnosis. And I did have a bit of a chat actually with the wonderful clinician that done my daughter's initial referral appointment, and she agreed that the waiting list is very, very long. Waiting for that time is very detrimental, and actually a lot of women are completely misdiagnosed. So therefore self-validation is actually really very quite valid, especially because autism is a neurodiversity that has no treatment. So therefore you might question, well, if I am somebody that is self-diagnosed, why do I not fully advocate self-diagnosis? Why do I sometimes see it as something that's potentially quite dangerous? And it's simply because I have watched, as an influencer, TikTok become this hub for diagnosis. So you have people making videos about autistic traits, or if you do this, you have ADHD. And although they're videos that make it accessible, they make it relatable, and that is really, really, really good, is also giving people the ability to look at those things, mesh them together, and confirm that actually they therefore have autism. And unfortunately, although autism has come a very, very long way, and neurodiversity in general has come a very, very long way, especially since I was younger, it's still not like where it needs to be. We still have this saying, which I absolutely hate, and I actually find it quite derogatory, of we all fit the spectrum, because actually we don't all fit the spectrum. We're not all a little bit autistic, because that completely invalidates an autist's natural struggles, and it makes it seem like what they're experiencing, how they're feeling and how they see the world isn't valid because everybody's on it. And it doesn't work like that. You can have traits of autism without being autistic. It's when there's either a really mass amount of traits, or those traits start to worm and mesh together, that autism becomes really quite relevant. So self-diagnosis from a social media point of view, I think is very, very hard. If you don't have autism potentially already in your family, in quite close family, I don't think self-diagnosis is a sensible idea. Or if you're particularly a younger person, I think it is a really good idea to potentially seek that diagnosis. But I do think for somebody, I mean, put it this way, there's a lot of countries, and I've said this quite a few times on social media at the moment, there's a lot of countries where if a child is diagnosed, their mum is automatically assessed. That's how well known it is that if a child has a neurodiversity, there's a big chance it's actually come from the mother line. Now, ironically, my children's father is also seeking his diagnosis. So it's come, I think, from both sides with my two children. My brother and my dad also show quite clear autistic traits. So for me, it's actually a really visible thing. It's a really visible diagnosis. And when you meet me, when you know me, when you see me, you know, in a somewhat comfortable state, I actually think it's quite obvious. I've spent my whole life being told how rude I am, how blunt I am, how I can be quite to the point and non-emotional. I always thought that's just because there was clearly something wrong with me. And actually, I get quite triggered if someone calls me rude. It actually really gets to me, because I never ever aim to be rude. That's not my intention. I have no reason to want to be rude to somebody. It's just me saying what I think and what I feel. So I find that really confusing, but I've spent my entire life questioning why I'm a bad person because of those things, when actually that I'm not a bad person. I just don't fluff things up for other people. Like, I don't have nothing, and it winds me up. I don't have filler words. So, you know, I can be having a conversation with somebody that's neurotypical, and they'll kind of fluff about a situation and a topic, and they'll put almost like these little like buffery words in to try and make the delivery smoother. And I'm like, just say it how it is. Just fucking say it, because then I can understand it. So that's my delivery on things, and that's perceived to be rude by somebody that's neurotypical. The amount of times I've been called rude on social media, and I'm really not trying to be rude. I'm just saying it how it is. I still don't feel like I've got that kind of sense of validation and acceptance at the moment that I can say openly, particularly on TikTok, actually I'm autistic. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of factors with me where it's actually really, really, really obvious. And I've got incredibly skilled at masking and at covering up my traits and needs and things like that, even down to stimming. I stim all the time. I have a particular stim that a lot of people actually know me for, and they think that I just do it because I'm nervous. It's not. I am literally stimming. So, you know, there's quite often an earlobe thing as part of the reason I actually plugged my ears, because it makes it easier for me to play with my earlobes. But that's a really, really common stim with me. So self-diagnosis, I think, as much as it can be valid, as much as it can lift that lid for somebody, it can also be quite dangerous. But then at the same time, I think you know you better than absolutely anybody else. And it is true how misdiagnosed women can be. You've got women out there that are being diagnosed with BPD when actually they have autism, or just severe depression when actually they're autistic. Women mask better than men can and will, and that's really well known within the autistic community. So there's many women out there, especially my generation and older, that are like autistic, and I have absolutely no idea that that is the case. So for women like that, women like myself, self-diagnosis is so valid, it's so important. But then you've also got that risk of giving the wrong impression to the wrong person, or the wrong impression to potentially a younger generation that kind of shuns autism towards a more dangerous side. And what I mean when I say by that is essentially an excuse for bad behaviour. So even I have seen some people excuse blunt, sheer rudeness, or, you know, nasty, verging on narcissistic behaviour for autism. Now, that's not an autistic trait. Autistic people are not narcissistic. They're not deliberately rude. And actually having autism doesn't inherently make you those things. So that's where I find self-diagnosis can be somewhat tricky to navigate and somewhat dangerous, because that's definitely a representation that the autistic community don't want. But, you know, for me personally, I don't have 4 to 5 years to wait to be able to say, well, actually, this is who I am and this is what I need. And I know better than any clinician who I am and what I need. I think that the current diagnosis structure is failing a lot of people, and that's why self-diagnosis has become so vital to certain communities. And actually the diagnosis assessment itself is much more tailored towards males than it is towards women. And that potentially needs to change, because it's always been kind of thought that autism is very much a male dominant diagnosis and condition, but it's not. It actually affects women very heavily, and we don't have enough female autism representation as it is. So it actually kind of, a lot of women aren't enabled to get the diagnosis and the help that they need and they require, and that's why they seek a self-diagnosis. And actually, when you speak to a lot of the autistic community, I'm incredibly lucky in the sense that a lot of my following are neurodiverse, and I don't know if that's because I've always spoken so openly about neurodiversity, if it's because they have something they relate to with me, but you know, the amount of messages, I've never ever had a message from another neurodiverse person that's told me that my self-diagnosis is not valid. In fact, it's the opposite. A lot of them actually say your diagnosis is so valid. Do not be afraid to say it. Don't be afraid to talk about it. Don't be afraid to help other people with it. You know, and that I value so much, because it's actually really hard feeling like you're not valid in a community that is potentially the only one that makes sense to you. So it's generally the people that are neurotypical that will fight a self-diagnosis and say that, no, that's not possible. No, you can't do that. But actually you'll find that neurodiverse people won't generally do that. They won't be that kind of crass and rude. So yeah, that's always an interesting transaction, so to speak. Another thing that I actually find quite tricky as well is if I do talk about diagnosis or self-diagnosis or autism in general and myself as a person versus my children, people be like, well, what are your symptoms? It's not an illness. I don't have symptoms, because symptoms indicate that it can go away and it can't. Or, well, what are your traits? We don't come with a prescriptive list of traits that I can just reel off to you and tell you what I experience, kind of thing. Like, people want to question, and I don't know sometimes if they want to question so that they can assess themselves against you, or if they are assessing you and whether you are genuinely like that kind of thing. But that can feel really quite intrusive, quite like invalidating, especially the traits question. I find that one really hard. I was literally on a live on TikTok the other day and someone said to me, well, what are your traits? And it's like, well, what do you want me to do? Do you literally want me to sit here and rattle off what's wrong with me? Because I don't think it's what's wrong with me, it's just how I work. And I'm also really nervous as an influencer to list my traits or what people want to hear as traits, just in case somebody's like, well, I relate to that and I'm like that, so therefore I must be autistic too. Like, I wouldn't want to influence somebody else into their own method of diagnosis. Mine literally only came about primarily because of my children and a little bit of self-awakening, and also because of my wife. So I never realised that it wasn't particularly normal to not want to be touched. It wasn't until I kind of met Kelly, who is very, very physical, that I realised that's not what's expected. I'd never really been in a relationship before that was kind of physically quite loving. So I actually really struggle with physical touch. I'm okay with Kelly now because I've built up that level of kind of trust, and I know that actually that I had to compromise with her because that's what she needs. And I'm not stupid, I'm just autistic. I'm not selfish, I'm just autistic. Like, I can do that. But it took me some time. So at first when she'd give me a hug, I'd be really quite stiff. I'd be like, because someone's touching me. If she gave me a kiss, I'd enjoy it, but I'd get to a point where I'd pull away. The only people that I'm physically really comfortable with showing affection is my children. So, I'll give my kids the biggest cuddle in the world. They're my kids, kind of thing. Even to the point where if I'm at the hairdresser's and she's washing my hair, Kelly laughs at this, but I'm literally like, get the fuck off me. I can feel her on my whole face. And for about 3 hours afterwards, I'm like, I just want to scrub my face because I can still feel her on me. Like, it's still there. And it really bothers me. If someone just generally touches me, I'm like, I can feel you for ages on me, please get off. And things like that. So I think that was quite a shocking revelation for both Kelly and myself. And then there's that emotional side as well. So Kels is she's a very sensitive soul. She's very, very emotionally in tune. She's very, she's very, very loving, very, very kind of affectionate. She's very, very loving, not just physically, but emotionally too. So for her, there's lots of I love yous. She wanted to talk to me all the time, not in a possessive way, but she just wanted to talk to me. She would text me good morning, she'd text me good night, she'd do all of these things, but for me it didn't register that I had to do those things. Like, if I walk into a room, I don't even sometimes register that I need to say hello to you, let alone text you in the morning and then text you again at night. I could go days without speaking to you, and it's not that I don't care, it's not that I don't want to speak to you, it's just that I know you're there. So in my head, I'm like, it doesn't register that I probably should check in with that person. And I can see now that to some people I probably could be considered quite cold and quite almost kind of clinical in the way that I am, but actually I am incredibly loving. I just don't necessarily show it in typical ways. So they were kind of like, I think, the first indicators really for Kelly to be like, actually you're quite similar to Warwick. And then when Kelly became my person, when I learnt that she was like a safe space for me, that dynamic completely changed. Now I'm like, right, you can touch me, I can touch you, like I want to talk to you all the time, are you there, are you okay, like she's my person. And it's a really, really strange dynamic, and it's kind of things that I don't really talk about publicly, but I think that was her first biggest kind of indicator. And then the first argument we had, me and Kels don't really argue. I can count maybe on fucking two hands how many times we've argued in 3 years. We talk, we don't argue with each other, but the only time we have really argued, I am very, very to the point. I don't shout at all, really, but I will be like, bang, 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 bang. That is my argument. This is what I think, and I'm going to leave that there with you. I definitely, that I have not even an ounce of fluff during those situations. And I never realised that can be quite kind of like cutting and quite like boom. So yeah, there's been a lot that's come through Kelly that's really made me see myself and see traits that I just thought was me as a bad person was actually that's my autism. And then on the flip side of that, you've almost got like a big kid in me sometimes. Like sensory, I can be really aware. I'm really, really noise sensitive. I stim so much, and I never realised how much I was holding stims in. So the earlobe is like a safe stim, but trust me, I'll be flapping, clapping, like all sorts of things, and I now do that in public. I'm that much more comfortable with myself than what I once was. And I've really kind of made a conscious effort to drop the mask. So I've actually lost a lot of friends, a hell of a lot of friends, who liked to claim that I was distorting things and changing a narrative when I was started to speak about my feelings, my situations, things that I'd been through, things that I'd done. And it wasn't that I was doing any of those things. It's like I was literally talking from the point of view that I felt and that I saw, which potentially is a little bit different to how they saw it and how they felt it. And for once in my life, I was like, you know what? I'm not bending my narrative to fit you and to soothe you. So if you don't like how I've perceived something, felt something, taken something, dealt with something, been through something, that's not my fault, and I'm not going to mask for you. So my dynamic of friendships really, really changed as well when I started to come forward and be more open about my autism, my autistic needs, and not necessarily label them, like label the reasons as autism, but just be a lot more kind of comfortable in the natural me and talking through things that I'd been through. A lot of people that thought they knew me, they knew a version of me that I wanted them to know because my mask keeps me safe, didn't like that. Kind of in conclusion, I think that for me, self-diagnosis is the most valid thing that I could ever do for myself. And I think for many, many women specifically, it will be. Because we seem to be very hard creatures to diagnose unless it is like literally staring you in the face. And And a lot of women of my generation need that level of comfort in who they are, why they are the way they are, and understanding themselves. Because if you are not aware that you are autistic, you are at risk of hitting autistic burnout. And autistic burnout can take years to recover from. And that is not something that anybody wants to have to go through. So, you know, in that moment, actually self-diagnosis is so important. The pathway to getting a diagnosis is tough. Nobody should have to wait 4 to 5 years so that they can understand who they are. And we have to bear in mind that actually all neurodiversities require a level of self-awareness, self-awareness and self-acceptance. However, you know, ADHD, a diagnosis clinically entitles you to some medications. Autism doesn't have that. It actually, a clinical diagnosis technically is just that. It's just a diagnosis. It kind of give you an entryway into anything help-wise. You're given this diagnosis and you're just left with it, and that's it. And even a private diagnosis, yes, it can happen. Yes, you can get one if you're willing to pay £1,000, and a lot of the time it's not recognised by the NHS, so it's actually useless anyway. So I don't think that gap has been bridged yet for adult diagnosis. And I think it's something that actually really does need to be improved. It needs to be worked on. I think you've got a lot of women out there that are absolutely in mental despair because they don't have any idea that what they are experiencing is actually autism. And trust me when I say that I have spent my whole life having to live in a world that I don't understand and that I'm constantly trying to fit into. That is exhausting. The mask that I wore for absolute decades of my life every single day is so exhausting. So, you know, you've got women 30, 40, 50, 60 that have probably been depressed their whole lives, anxious. My anxiety, honestly, at times has crippled me. It's stopped me from really leaving my house properly. And they have no idea that that is potentially bred from being autistic. So, is a self-diagnosis valid? I think it is, personally. Is a self-diagnosis important? To some people, yes. To some people like me that probably never stand a chance of really getting a clinical diagnosis or waiting for a very, very long time for one, I do think that's very important. So it's the TikTok diagnoses that I don't think are necessarily safe. And I think it's very easy for people to sit here and list off all these traits. If you have these traits, then you could potentially have autism or ADHD. But I don't think that's actually helping anybody. So, you know, the autistic community is growing. It is definitely coming on leaps and bounds. It is definitely getting to that point where equality, inclusivity, like diversity, it's all starting to become so prevalent in everyday life. But I think that actually there's a long, long way to come for autistic people. And if you are sitting there wondering whether you potentially have autism, then I would say personally, either do a hell of a lot of research, like a lot of research. Don't just jump to self-diagnosis straight away. It took me a long, long time to get to that point where I was like, actually, this makes sense for me. Like, we're talking a couple of years. And if you are comfortable, if you're happy to, then definitely seek medical kind of diagnosis. So have a chat with your GP, see if you can be put on that pathway, and get that kind of clarification for yourself. For me, I might potentially one day seek a private diagnosis. It's something that's kind of really bubbled in and out of my head a lot over the last kind of couple of months. And it's figuring out what that diagnosis would actually give to me as a person, because ultimately it doesn't change really anything for me, apart from a bigger level of understanding. But I'm kind of at the point where, and actually a lot of autistic women have said this, that ultimately a clinician cannot tell you what you are and are not in that sense. And there's so much stigma around female diagnosis, to the point where actually some clinicians won't diagnose you for fear of further stigma. There's also a lot of, like I've said, misdiagnosis. It gets misrepresented for so many other things. And I think that puts a lot of women off diagnosis. I think they fear it. I know I certainly at times have really feared seeking that level of certainty through fear of misdiagnosis or being told that I'm wrong, and then that just leaves me in a complete state of absolute, well, what on earth is going on? So that's where kind of self-diagnosis becomes really valuable for me, because ultimately if I have a child that is diagnosed, I've got another one that is mid-diagnosis, and I am naturally incredibly similar to both those children. Does that not say it all for me? Who knows? But I know that self-diagnosis has been a very hot topic. I know that a lot of creators have come under fire for self-diagnosis, and I know that some media representation such as the BBC has been very questionable and has actually not advocated and spoken well for the autistic or neurodiverse communities, which I think is very, very unfair. But I would just simply say, as I've just said, take your time, do your research, and don't just jump to that diagnosis. I think it's something that really does take time to settle in yourself. So that's kind of the start of Tanks Talks on Autism. It's still a relatively fresh subject for me. It's still something that's quite new and something that I've not necessarily fully worked out about myself yet. So it's a developing one, this one. But I'm going to wrap it up there for today. As always, thank you. As always, I love you. Don't forget to subscribe, whether you are on Spotify or on YouTube, because basically I would like it if you did. And I will catch you next week, where I actually haven't fully planned out next week's episode yet. So I'm kind of not going to wing it, but I'm going to see where this week takes me, because I'm recording this one 2 weeks in advance, because it's my birthday week. So this is going to come out on Tuesday, and it's my birthday on Friday. So yeah, peace out. I will catch you soon. And I can't believe that actually on this episode, Tanks Talks is officially a month old again. That feels like a birthday within a birthday week. That's banging. Love ya.